12 years of marriage, 12 years of sacrifices, late nights and second jobs, all so my wife could chase her dream of becoming a top lawyer. And how did she repay me? With a text message saying she needed space. 3 days later, I was handed divorce papers in front of my students. I found out she left me for her rich boss, the man who flaunted his wealth, his connections, and promised her a life I could never provide. I was humiliated. I lost my wife, my dignity, and soon after, even the home my parents had given me. But life has a funny way of revealing the truth. When her boss's empire collapsed in scandal, she came crawling back begging for forgiveness. What she didn't know was I had already built a new life, one that didn't include her. So when she knocked on my door, I was ready. What would you do if your spouse betrayed you for money and came back with nothing? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Revenge with Chris for more stories like mine. Because sometimes the best revenge is moving on. I wasn't born into wealth, but I was raised to believe in hard work, loyalty, and building a life together, brick by brick. When I met Stephanie in college, she was ambitious, driven, and I was smitten. She told me she wanted to be a top lawyer one day. I told her I'd be by her side when she got there. We got married right after graduation. I took a job as a high school teacher in Austin. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. Teaching history gave me purpose. Stephanie, on the other hand, had bigger dreams. Law school wasn't cheap and scholarships only covered so much. So I picked up extra shifts, tutoring summer programs, even weekend jobs. Every dollar I made went toward her education, her future, our future. I didn't mind. I believe that's what partners do. When one of us had a dream, the other carried the weight until we both could stand at the top. By the time Stephanie graduated and landed a job at a prestigious law firm, I thought the hardest days were behind us. Her salary dwarfed mine overnight. Suddenly, we could afford nicer things, better cars, fancy dinners, vacations we used to only talk about. At first, it felt like a reward for years of struggle. But slowly, as things changed, Stephanie started making little comments, jokes about how I was too comfortable as a teacher, how I lacked the drive that her colleagues had. She'd laugh it off, but each word chipped away at me. I wasn't blind. I knew I didn't wear tailored suits or close big deals in boardrooms, but I thought she still respected me for being steady, for being supportive. As months turned into years, Stephanie's world grew more luxurious, and mine stayed grounded in lesson plans and grading papers. She began spending more time at the office, late nights, weekend conferences, exclusive galas. I stayed home handling the chores, cooking dinner, making sure everything was ready when she returned. I told myself it was just a phase, that once she settled into her career, we'd find balance again. But then came William, the founding partner of her firm, a man twice her age with a fortune built on high-profile cases and political connections. Stephanie spoke about him often, how brilliant he was, how much she was learning under his mentorship. I wanted to believe that's all it was, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The night she came home smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't mine, the secretive texts, the sudden urge to manage our finances, asking me to deposit my paychecks directly into a joint account she controlled. I ignored the signs because what else could I do? Accuse my wife, the woman I supported through everything, of betrayal. I wasn't ready to face that possibility. Then came the night she didn't come home at all. No call, no explanation, just a text the next morning. I need space to reevaluate where we're headed. I stared at that message for hours, hoping it was some terrible misunderstanding. 3 days later, reality hit me harder than I could have imagined. A courier walked into my classroom while I was in the middle of a lecture and handed me an envelope, divorce papers filed with urgency, citing irreconcilable differences, requesting an expedited process. I could feel my students' eyes on me as I stood there holding the end of my marriage and shaking hands. I wanted to disappear, but instead I folded the papers, placed them on my desk, and finished my lesson. That weekend, while scrolling through social media, I saw them. Stephanie and William, dressed to the nines, smiling for cameras at a charity gala. It hadn't even been a week. 12 years of love, sacrifice, and partnership. Discarded like yesterday's news, I was heartbroken. But more than that, I was humiliated. And in that moment, I realized something painful. The woman I married no longer existed. In the days that followed, I went through the motions like a ghost. teaching by day, sitting alone in a quiet house by night. I kept asking myself, how did we get here? How did the woman I sacrificed everything for turn into someone who could humiliate me so easily? But the answers didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Then came the first real punch. While sorting through mail, I noticed something strange. Bank statements I didn't recognize. Accounts I never opened, loans I never applied for. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. But as I dug deeper, the truth hit me harder than any betrayal ever could. Stephanie had taken out a second mortgage on our home. The house my parents had gifted us, the one place I thought was untouchable. And she'd done it by forging my signature. Thousands of dollars withdrawn over the past year. Money funneled into luxury expenses, designer clothes, exotic trips, expensive gifts. Not for us, but for her and William. I felt sick. It wasn't enough that she left me. She had gutted the very foundation of my life before walking out the door. A week later, I received notice from the bank. If payments weren't made, foreclosure was imminent. I tried to fight it, but legally my name was on the paperwork. Even if I never signed it, I was being forced out of the home where I built every memory of our marriage. Standing in that empty living room surrounded by boxes I never thought I'd pack, I realized I had lost everything. My wife, my dignity, and now, my home. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you a kind of clarity you never had before. I stopped asking why. I stopped hoping she'd feel remorse. Stephanie had made her choice. She traded loyalty for luxury, love for status. I could have drowned in bitterness, but instead, I made a decision. If I was going to rebuild, I'd do it on my own terms. First, I hired a better attorney, not just to finalize the divorce, but to investigate. We gathered evidence of the forged documents, ensuring I wouldn't be liable for Stephanie's debts once the dust settled. It didn't save the house, but it protected what little I had left. Then I took a long, hard look at my life. For years, I'd put my dreams on hold, telling myself I was doing it for us. But there was no us anymore. And for the first time, I was free to think about what I wanted. That's when I remembered the acceptance letter. A year before, I'd secretly applied for a position as a university professor in another state. I never pursued it because Stephanie didn't want to leave her firm. Now nothing was holding me back. While I prepared for that next chapter, something unexpected happened. Claire, she was a fellow teacher, someone who had always been a friend, offering quiet support when my world fell apart. There was no judgment in her eyes, no condescension about my career or salary, just genuine kindness. We started spending more time together, coffee after school, long conversations about life, books, and everything in between. It wasn't planned, but slowly the weight on my chest began to lift. For the first time in years, I felt seen, respected, valued. Meanwhile, Stephanie's life looked picture perfect on the surface. Social media posts of lavish parties, weekend getaways, and private events with William. But I knew better. I'd lived long enough in her world to recognize when something was built on appearances. Still, I stayed quiet. I focused on my own path, refusing to let resentment dictate my future. But deep down, I had a feeling. When something rises that fast, it rarely lasts, and I was right. The day I handed over the keys to my parents' house was the day something inside me snapped. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. I stood on that porch one last time, realizing that every piece of my old life had been stripped away. There was nothing left to hold on to. For 12 years, I measured my worth by how much I could support Stephanie. Her dreams became my mission. Her success was supposed to be our success. But standing there watching the place I called home slip through my fingers, I finally accepted a truth I'd avoided for far too long. I had been living for someone who never intended to stay. That realization hurt more than anything. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the understanding that I had sacrificed pieces of myself for a version of love that was never real to her. I moved into a modest apartment near the university campus where I'd soon start my new position. It was small, simple. But it was mine. No shared accounts, no whispered criticisms, no walking on eggshells. For the first time in over a decade, I could hear my own thoughts without them being drowned out by someone else's expectations. But freedom, it came with a heavy silence. Nights were the worst. That's when memories crept in, the good ones. The ones that made me question if I'd ever truly be whole again. I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering if I was destined to carry this weight forever. Then came a letter. Not from Stephanie, not from the bank, but from the university. It was a simple envelope. Inside was a welcome packet, details about my new role, housing assistance, and a note from the department head expressing how excited they were to have me join their faculty. It shouldn't have meant much, but holding that letter, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Pride. Not pride tied to someone else's achievements. Not pride that came from being the supportive husband behind the scenes. This was mine, earned by my own merit, my own passion. That night I packed away the last remnants of my marriage. Photos, keepsakes, everything that tied me to a past I no longer needed. I wasn't running away, I was choosing to step forward. Claire noticed the change in me. She'd always been patient, never pushing, never prying. One evening, as we shared coffee in my barely furnished apartment, she said something that stuck with me. "You're not the same man who walked out of that house." I looked at her confused. She smiled softly and added, "You're lighter now, like you finally remember who you are." And she was right. Losing everything forced me to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self. I wasn't just Daniel Morgan, the man who supported his wife's career. I was a teacher, a mentor, a man who found strength in survival. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating through legal circles. I didn't pay much attention at first, but then a former colleague of Stephanie's reached out. "Have you heard about William?" That was all the message said. Curiosity got the better of me. A quick search revealed headlines that made my heart race. Federal investigation launched into prominent law firms' financial practices. Founding partner accused of fraud, embezzlement. William's empire, the one Stephanie had abandoned me for, was crumbling, client funds missing, investors pulling out, criminal charges looming. I should have felt vindicated. I should have laughed or celebrated. But all I felt was a quiet sense of confirmation. The life Stephanie chased was built on sand, and the tide had finally come in. I didn't reach out. I didn't gloat. I just kept moving forward, focused on my new role, my new life, and the person I was becoming. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the past came knocking, and 3 weeks later, it did. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. Claire was at a conference. My neighbors knew I kept to myself when I opened the door. There she was, Stephanie, soaked from the rain, eyes red and swollen, clutching a handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. Gone was the confident, sharp-tongued woman who once told me I was holding her back. "Daniel, please." Her voice cracked barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, letting her in, not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. She stood in my modest living room, glancing around like she couldn't comprehend how I'd gone from our upscale house to this simple space. But I wasn't embarrassed. This apartment represented freedom, something she'd never understand. "I made a mistake," she began, her hands trembling. "William, he's lost everything. The firm's gone. He's facing prison. And me?" She swallowed hard, tears welling up. "I was let go. No one wants to hire someone associated with that scandal. My accounts are frozen. I have nowhere else to go." I watched her carefully, every word dripping with desperation. She wasn't here because she missed me. She was here because her safety net had snapped. I thought, maybe we could try again. "We had 12 good years, Daniel." I almost laughed. 12 good years, 12 years where I carried the weight of both our lives, while she climbed over me to reach for something shinier. But I didn't lash out. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I walked over to my desk and picked up an envelope. "Funny you mentioned 12 years, I said calmly, handing it to her. She opened it, her brow furrowing as she read the letter inside. It was my official acceptance for the university position, complete with relocation details. "I got this offer during our marriage," I explained, "but I turned it down because you didn't want to leave Austin." You said my career wasn't worth moving for? Her lips parted, but no words came out. After you left, I accepted I start next month. She looked up at me, panic flashing across her face. Daniel, we can rebuild. I know I hurt you, but I cut her off with a quiet shake of my head. There's more. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed 2 mugs, and filled them with coffee. A moment later, Claire walked through the door, returning early from her conference. She paused when she saw Stephanie, but quickly composed herself. Hi, you must be Stephanie, Claire said politely, taking the mug from my hand and sitting beside me. Stephanie's face drained of color. You're seeing someone? I nodded, my expression calm. Claire's been a good friend, someone who respects me not for how much I earn, but for who I am. Stephanie's eyes welled up again, but this time I saw something different. It wasn't just regret, it was realization. She wasn't just losing a place to stay. She was losing the man she thought would always be her fallback. I gave you everything I had. Stephanie, I said quietly. And when I had nothing left to give you, left without looking back, I stood up, walking to the door and opening it. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it's not here anymore. For a moment she didn't move. Then with a shaky breath, she walked past me out into the rain. I closed the door behind her, feeling nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just closure. Because real revenge isn't about shouting or slamming doors. It's about standing tall when the person who broke you realizes they no longer have the power to shake you. Claire reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. You okay? She asked. I nodded. I'm more than okay. I was free. The door clicked shut behind Stephanie, but in many ways it felt like I was closing a chapter that had been long overdue. I stood there for a moment, listening to the rain fade into the background. No part of me wanted to watch her walk away. There was nothing left to say. Claire moved beside me, her presence grounding steady. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She knew that moment wasn't about revenge. It was about release. The next morning, I packed the last of my things for the move. A fresh start, not running away, but stepping into a life I had chosen for myself. Before leaving town, I stopped by my old school to say goodbye to a few colleagues. As I walked through the halls where I'd once felt humiliated, holding divorce papers in front of my students, I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't that man anymore. News about William's downfall continued to dominate headlines. His assets were seized, his properties auctioned off, and his once powerful name became synonymous with fraud. Stephanie's name popped up occasionally, always as a footnote, never the headline. Though cleared of criminal charges, her reputation was destroyed. No firm wanted to associate with someone tied to one of the biggest scandals in the state. A mutual friend mentioned she was staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, burning through what little cash she had left. Her designer lifestyle reduced to survival mode. There was a time when hearing that would have satisfied some bitter part of me. But now, I just felt indifferent. I had learned that true closure doesn't come from watching someone fall. It comes from knowing their fall no longer defines you. Weeks turned into months. Claire and I settled into our new city, and I embraced my role as a university professor. Standing in front of a lecture hall filled with eager students, I rediscovered the passion that had once made me love teaching. But this time, it wasn't overshadowed by someone else's ambitions. One afternoon after class, I received a message from an unknown number. I know I don't deserve to ask, but can we talk just once? Stephanie. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. In the end, I typed 2 words, "There's nothing." I hit send and immediately blocked the number that was the last I ever heard from her. Months later, I learned through mutual acquaintances that Stephanie had declared bankruptcy. Her car was repossessed. She was working part-time at a legal call center, far from the courtrooms she once dreamed of ruling. As for William, he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Their world of wealth, power, and illusion had evaporated. Meanwhile, mine was just beginning. Claire and I traveled nothing extravagant, just simple road trips. Hiking trails, coffee shops in small towns. Things Stephanie would have scoffed at. But with Claire, every moment felt genuine. There were no masks, no games. Just 2 people who valued honesty over appearances. One evening, as we watched the sunset from our balcony, Claire turned to me. Do you ever think about her? I knew who she meant. I took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over me. Sometimes, I admitted, but not with anger, more like a reminder. Claire raised an eyebrow, curious. A reminder of what? I smiled faintly. That losing her was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because if Stephanie hadn't walked out, if she hadn't betrayed me, I might still be stuck in a life where I was valued only for what I could provide, not for who I was. Her leaving forced me to reclaim myself, to stop living in someone else's shadow. And that to me was worth more than any revenge I could have planned. As the sky darkened and the stars appeared, I realized something profound. Sometimes the people who break you are the same people who unknowingly set you free. It's strange how life works. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be living in a different state, teaching at a university and sharing my life with someone who truly valued me, I would have laughed. Back then, my world revolved around keeping a broken marriage afloat. I thought loyalty meant enduring anything, even being diminished. But here's what I've learned. Loyalty without respect is just self-sacrifice. And love that demands you shrink yourself isn't love at all. Stephanie didn't ruin my life, she revealed it. She exposed the parts of me that I had ignored for too long, the dreams I buried, the dignity I surrendered, the quiet voice inside telling me I deserved more. When she walked away, I thought I had lost everything. But in reality, I was given a gift most people never recognize until it's too late. The chance to rebuild on my own terms. I don't hate her. I don't wish her harm. I hope one day she understands that chasing illusions of wealth and status will never replace genuine connection or integrity. As for me, I wake up each morning with a sense of peace I never knew I was missing. My days are filled with purpose, teaching students who remind me why I chose this path in the first place. My evenings are spent with someone who sees me not as a stepping stone, but as a partner. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take from my story, it's this. Never let someone convince you that your worth is measured by your paycheck, your title, or how well you fit into their version of success. The right people will never ask you to prove your value. They'll recognize it even in the simplest things. And if someone walks out because they think the grass is greener elsewhere, let them go. Because when their illusions fade and they come crawling back, you'll already be standing tall, too far ahead to ever look back. So to anyone who feels discarded, underestimated, or betrayed, remember sometimes losing what you thought you couldn't live without is exactly what sets you free.